The Whitworth Manor loomed over the village of Ravensbrook like a dark sentinel, its spires piercing the fog that clung stubbornly to the rolling hills. The locals often whispered of the house in hushed tones, as if even the wind might carry their words to the inhabitants within. To many, it was merely an ancient estate, grand, imposing, and somewhat forlorn. But to those who knew the history, it was a place of dread, a monument to generations of whispered secrets and unspeakable acts. Its stone walls had witnessed more than mere births and deaths. They had absorbed despair, malice, and the faint, lingering echoes of cries that were never answered. The Whitworth family had been a fixture of the county for centuries, tracing their lineage back to merchants and magistrates who once wielded influence across the region. Yet, over time, wealth and respect had soared into suspicion and fear. The villagers spoke of the patriarch, Elias Whitworth, as a man whose gaze alone could unnerve a stranger. Stern and unyielding, he bore a reputation for cruelty, not the brazen kind that could be easily prosecuted, but the insidious sort that left no proof, only lasting unease. He was known to enforce the harshest discipline upon his children, and tales circulated of his late, night walks through the manor corridors, muttering to shadows that no one else could see. Elias's children, Clara, Jonathan, and Margaret, were raised in the heavy shadow of his authority. They were rarely seen beyond the manor's iron gates, which were always locked, even in the brightest daylight. Neighbors recounted glimpses of pale faces behind curtained windows, eyes that seemed hollow, or flickers of movement in rooms where none should be. Yet the Whitworths did not merely exist in isolation, they seemed almost to thrive on it. Each child inherited the peculiarities of their lineage. Jonathan with his sudden bursts of rage, Margaret with a fascination for death and the macabre, and Clara, whose gentle demeanor belayed a mind sharp enough to perceive the darkness that bound her family. Ravensbrook itself was a village caught between respect and fear. Markets were held in the daylight, but by dusk townsfolk hurried indoors, casting nervous glances toward the looming manor. The river that meandered through the valley was said to carry the whispers of those who had vanished mysteriously, and livestock occasionally disappeared, only for the villagers to shake their heads and mutter about the Whitworths. No one dared speak openly of what they feared, but everyone knew. The Whitworths were different, and their manor was a place where shadows breathed. Even the architecture of the house seemed designed to intimidate. Tall, narrow windows cast long, angular shadows across the hallways, while hidden staircases and secret chambers created a labyrinthine interior that invited both awe and terror. The air inside was always cold, heavy with the scent of aged wood and candle wax, and at times faint traces of smoke would rise from chimneys with no fire beneath them. Candles flickered without wind. Doors creaked open when no hand was near, and portraits of stern ancestors seemed to follow visitors with watchful eyes. It was a house alive in ways the village could not fully comprehend. Yet beyond the fear, there was also curiosity, a dark fascination that drew some brave or foolish enough to wander too close. Stories of disappearances and sudden illnesses were common, and some whispered of strange symbols carved into walls or artifacts hidden within the manor's many rooms. No record of these things existed outside family recollection, and the Whitworths themselves spoke little, their polite smiles masking intentions known only to themselves. This tale begins in the year 1881, when the last vestiges of Victorian England's rigid social order had begun to give way to modernity, yet superstition and rumor held firm in places like Ravensbrook. It was in this year that the first tremors of a sinister pattern began, a series of events that would cement the Whitworth name in local legend and infamy. Strange occurrences multiplied, the air grew thick with tension, and the line between reality and nightmare blurred within the manor's walls. By the time the century drew to a close, whispers of the Whitworths had spread far beyond the village, leaving an indelible mark on all who encountered their dark legacy. In the pages that follow, you will encounter the story of a family bound by blood and curse, of lives shaped and destroyed by obsession, fear, and a darkness that refused to die quietly. This is not a tale for the faint of heart, nor is it a recounting of mere tragedies. It is the history of the Whitworths, a sinister tale of ambition, cruelty, and a darkness that thrived behind the grand facade of wealth and respectability. And it begins as all dark tales do, in a house where shadows never sleep. The year was 1881, and the village of Ravensbrook lay shrouded in an unusually thick mist. Morning dew clung to the cobblestones, shimmering under the pale light of a timid sun. From a distance, the Whitworth Manor dominated the horizon, its dark silhouette etched sharply against the gray sky. Locals often paused in silence as they glimpsed its towering spires and the slate roofs that glimmered like cold metal in the damp light. To the villagers, the manor was more than a building. It was a presence, a living entity whose gaze could pierce the soul. Its massive gates, forged from wrought iron, were closed nearly every day, and only the occasional flicker of movement behind the tall, narrow windows hinted that the house was occupied. The manor had stood for over a century, built by ancestors whose ambition and cruelty had left an indelible mark on the estate. Every stone seemed to hum with the memories of the past, the victories and failures, the whispered secrets, the silent screams. The walls were thick and cold, and the air inside was heavy, scented faintly with decayed old wood and the lingering aroma of extinguished candles. The windows, tall and narrow, were deliberately placed to catch the light in angles that cast long, unnatural shadows. It was said that in the flicker of these shadows, one might glimpse things that should not exist, forms that watched silently, waiting. Elias Whitworth, the patriarch of the family, was a man of imposing stature. His black hair, streaked prematurely with gray, was always neatly combed back, and his piercing blue eyes seemed to see more than they should. Rumors had followed him since youth, stories of cruelty that bordered on the unnatural, the whispers of discipline so severe it left the mark of fear etched into the hearts of those who dared defy him. Elias walked through his halls as if they were veins in a living organism, each footstep measured, deliberate, and heavy. He spoke rarely, and when he did, his voice carried a weight that could silence even the most unruly servant. Within the manor, life moved according to a rhythm dictated by fear and ritual. His children, Clara, Jonathan, and Margaret, each inherited traits from their father, though in different forms. Clara, the eldest, possessed a keen intellect and a quiet curiosity that often led her to question her surroundings, though she dared not speak openly of her thoughts. Jonathan was prone to sudden bursts of temper, unpredictable and terrifying in their intensity. Margaret, the youngest, carried a fascination for death and the macabre, spending hours sketching scenes that left the household servants uneasy. All three children were bound by the invisible chains of their father's expectations, and their interactions were tinged with suspicion, mistrust, and an unspoken dread. Outside the manor, Ravensbrook itself was a village caught between reverence and fear. Markets bustled in daylight, but by evening the villagers hurried home, casting anxious glances toward the looming estate. Stories of disappearances, livestock found dead under mysterious circumstances, and strange lights flickering in the manor windows kept the villagers on edge. Children were warned never to venture near the manor after sunset, and even the bravest adults avoided the overgrown paths that led to its gates. Some claimed to hear faint cries carried on the wind, though none dared investigate. The air around Whitworth Manor seemed thicker, heavier, as if the estate itself exhaled an oppressive force. The architecture of the manor was designed as much to intimidate as to house the family. Corridors twisted and turned like the branches of an ancient, gnarled tree. Hidden staircases led to rooms that even the children did not fully understand, and secret doors opened into chambers whose existence was known only to the family. The furniture, dark and imposing, bore the marks of generations, carvings of grotesque faces, clawed legs, and twisted vines. Portraits of stern ancestors lined the walls, their eyes unnervingly lifelike, following the movements of anyone who dared enter the halls. Candles flickered without wind, doors creaked open without touch, and the cold, damp air often carried whispers that had no discernible source. On this particular morning, the manor seemed to breathe with an unusual restlessness. Clara stood by the tall window in her room, watching the mist curl through the village below. She had long ago learned to read the subtle signs. The flicker of shadows that moved independently of light, the sudden chill that hinted at unseen presences, the faint scent of decay that sometimes filled the air without explanation. Today, the manor felt alive in a way it rarely did. The shadows seemed deeper, the silence heavier, as though something was stirring within the walls themselves. Elias descended the grand staircase, each step echoing through the cavernous halls. The children sensed his approach before he appeared, a mixture of fear and awe marking their movements. Jonathan's jaw tightened, Margaret's sketches trembled in her hands, and Clara's heart pounded, not in panic, but in a quiet, knowing dread. He passed through the halls without word, surveying each room with an intensity that seemed to pierce through walls, floors, and souls alike. As the day wore on, the village began to murmur again. A young boy had gone missing near the edge of the estate's grounds, and although searchers combed the misty paths, there was no sign of him. The villagers exchanged worried glances, whispers of the Whitworth curse threading through their conversations. They spoke of generations of misfortune tied to the family, of dark bargains struck long before their own lives began. No one could prove the stories, yet all felt their weight. And so the manor remained, a looming testament to history, secrecy, and dread. Within its walls, the Whitworth family continued their quiet rituals, their lives intertwined with shadows and whispers. Outside, Ravensbrook trembled under the unspoken threat that the manor represented. By the time evening fell, the fog thickened, the wind carried faint cries, and the first hints of something sinister began to stir within the darkened rooms. The shadows of Whitworth Manor stretched long across the land, and even in 1881, it was clear that the house, and the family it sheltered, would leave a mark on history that would not fade. Beneath the grandeur and wealth lay a darkness that would claim the innocent, the curious, and, perhaps, those who dared to challenge the unyielding will of the Whitworths. The story of their sin, fear, and the inevitable horrors that would follow had only just begun. The Whitworth Manor was more than a house, it was a vault of secrets. Behind every locked door, beneath every faded tapestry, and beneath the cold stone floors, the echoes of hidden lives reverberated, lives that few in Ravensbrook ever glimpsed. By the year 1885, 4 years after the events that had left the village uneasy, the Whitworth children had grown into roles dictated by their father's unyielding will, and the manor itself seemed to close in around them, pressing its dark history into their bones. Clara Whitworth, now 16, had inherited her mother's sharp mind, but none of her warmth. She spent hours in the manor's vast library, poring over books on medicine history and the occult. Her curiosity often drew her into forbidden chambers, where dust and cobwebs claimed the air, and the faint smell of iron lingered. It was here she discovered journals belonging to her ancestors, each page more disturbing than the last. The writings spoke of strange rituals, secret societies, and deals struck with forces that no one alive dared name aloud. Clara's heart would race as she read, yet she could not stop. She began to realize that the darkness surrounding her family was not rumor or superstition. It was carefully documented history. Jonathan, her older brother by 2 years, had begun exhibiting an unsettling fascination with control. He would spend long hours walking the corridors, whispering to shadows and tracing patterns in the dust. Servants reported seeing him staring at mirrors as if trying to communicate with someone behind the glass. Jonathan's temper was explosive, and many feared the day it might turn violent. Yet beneath the rage lay a meticulous mind. He documented everything that happened in the manor with obsessive precision, though his writings were rarely shared. The boy seemed almost to derive strength from the manor itself, his presence amplifying the oppressive aura that hung over the estate. Margaret, the youngest at 14, was perhaps the most enigmatic. While her siblings sought knowledge or control, Margaret was drawn to decay and death. She collected bones, studied the decomposition of small animals, and sketched figures with hollow eyes and twisted limbs. Servants whispered that she had inherited the evil touch of the Whitworth line, the ability to sense death before it came, to see shadows where none existed. In her room, Margaret displayed macabre art that would make even the most hardened observer shiver, yet she seemed unaware of the terror she invoked. Her fascination was not morbid curiosity alone, it was as though she were preparing unconsciously for a role that the family's dark legacy demanded. Elias, ever the watchful patriarch, allowed these peculiarities to flourish, provided they did not undermine his authority. He believed that the Whitworth name must remain above reproach, but he also understood that power required secrecy, and secrecy required fear. The family's isolation was to liberate the fewer people who entered the manor, the fewer who could witness or question the deeds within. Villagers were tolerated only as necessary, servants were closely monitored, and any who displeased the family were quietly dismissed or disappeared. Even Clara, bright and inquisitive as she was, knew that certain doors were never to be opened, certain questions never asked. The manor itself seemed to be complicit in the family's secrets. Hidden passageways connected rooms in ways that made little architectural sense, and certain corridors were known only to the Whitworths. Behind a false panel in the library, Clara discovered a small, candlelit chamber filled with strange symbols etched into the walls. The air was thick, and shadows seemed to move independently of the flickering light. On a pedestal in the center of the room lay a collection of artifacts, an intricately carved dagger, a tarnished silver chalice, and a book bound in cracked leather that radiated an almost palpable sense of dread. Clara's instincts warned her to leave, but fascination rooted her to the spot. She could not yet grasp the purpose of the items, but she felt their power pressing against her very soul. The villagers, meanwhile, whispered of the Whitworths with a mixture of fear and fascination. They spoke of lights in the manor at impossible hours, of sounds that carried over the misty fields, and of figures glimpsed in windows that vanished when approached. Children who strayed too close to the estate sometimes returned pale and silent, and livestock that wandered near the manor's borders occasionally disappeared. No one could explain these events, yet the pattern was undeniable. The Whitworths were a family apart, operating under rules that the rest of the world could not comprehend. Even among themselves, the Whitworth children held secrets. Jonathan would sometimes sneak into Margaret's room to inspect her sketches, his eyes narrowing at the grotesque images. Margaret, in turn, observed Clara with a silent intensity, sensing her curiosity might one day unearth truths the family wished to keep hidden, and Clara, for her part, understood that knowledge came at a price. Every question she asked, every forbidden door she opened, brought her closer to the darkness her father had cultivated over generations. Yet she could not stop herself. The desire to understand, to unravel the secrets of the Whitworths, burned hotter than any fear. One evening, as the fog rolled thick across the estate, Clara discovered a letter tucked away in the pages of an old ledger. The handwriting was unfamiliar, yet elegant, and the words chilled her blood. It spoke of a pact made centuries ago, a bargain with unnamed forces that promised wealth and influence in exchange for obedience and sacrifice. The letter warned that defiance would carry dire consequences, not only for those who broke the pact, but for the entire bloodline. Clara felt a shiver run down her spine. She understood then that the darkness she sensed was no accident. It was a living, breathing curse, entwined with her very blood, and it demanded loyalty, secrecy, and fear. As night fell over Ravensbrook, the manor's windows glowed with an eerie light. Shadows danced along the walls, and the whispers of the past seemed to swell in the corners of the rooms. The Whitworth family sat for dinner in silence, the air thick with unspoken tension. Outside, the village slept uneasily, unaware of the secrets growing stronger within the manor walls. And somewhere deep in the heart of the estate, hidden from all but the family, the true nature of the Whitworth legacy waited, patient and unrelenting, ready to claim the souls of those who dared to challenge it. By the end of that night, Clara understood one immutable truth: to know the Whitworths was to confront darkness itself, and to confront that darkness was to risk being consumed by it. And so the manor lived on, its secrets safely hidden behind stone and shadow, as the family continued their quiet, sinister existence, a family of secrets, bound together by fear, mystery, and a darkness older than anyone could remember. By the year 1885, the fog that so often rolled across Ravensbrook seemed to cling more persistently to the village. Even the sun, when it pierced the gray skies, could not fully dispel the chill that settled over the cobblestones and thatched roofs. The villagers spoke less and less openly, and the Whitworth manor, perched high on its hill, cast longer, darker shadows than ever before. It was during this year that the first disappearance in a generation shook Ravensbrook to its core, a disappearance that would mark the Whitworths in local legend and cast a pall over the village for years to come. Samuel Dyer, a young servant employed at the manor, was diligent and quiet, the kind of worker the Whitworths preferred. He had been raised in the village and had accepted employment at Whitworth Manor out of necessity, drawn by the promise of steady wages and room within the sprawling estate. Samuel was curious but careful, often wandering the lesser, used corridors of the manor to clean or carry messages, always mindful of the watchful eyes of the family. He had seen things that unnerved him: strange markings in hidden chambers, candles that burned without smoke, shadows that seemed to move independently. But he kept his observations to himself. After all, questions or complaints at the Whitworths' estate could be dangerous. One evening, as the sky darkened and the fog thickened, Samuel was tasked with fetching supplies from the manor's storage cellars. These cellars, beneath the oldest wing of the house, were rarely visited, even by seasoned staff, for their air was heavy with mildew and something else, something Samuel could not name. Some of the older servants whispered of strange chanting heard from below, though none dared linger long enough to verify the stories. That evening, Samuel descended the worn stone steps, candle in hand, unaware that this routine task would become his last. Hours passed, and when Samuel failed to return for dinner, concern began to ripple through the household. Servants searched the cellars, the corridors, and even the hidden passageways that connected the manor's more obscure rooms, but there was no sign of him. His candle had been found at the base of the steps, burned down to the wick, but Samuel himself was gone. Panic rippled outward from the manor into the village. Rumors spread like wildfire. Had he fled? Had something within the manor claimed him? Or was the dark legacy of the Whitworths at play once more? Villagers, who had long regarded the Whitworths with cautious fear, whispered of a curse. The family, they said, had always been involved in matters that touched the unnatural, and the disappearance was surely a consequence of this hidden power. The village constable, Thomas Hargrove, was summoned to investigate. He was a practical man, grounded in logic and reason, yet even he felt a chill when crossing the threshold of Whitworth Manor. The manor seemed alive that night, shadows shifting along the walls, doors creaking without wind, and a faint, almost imperceptible humming that filled the air. Hargrove's instincts screamed that the estate was no ordinary house, and that the Whitworth's secrets were older and darker than he could have imagined. Elias Whitworth, upon learning of Samuel's disappearance, displayed a cold, measured concern. He instructed the staff to remain calm and offered little comfort to the searching villagers. Jonathan and Margaret, both observing with silent intensity, seemed more intrigued than troubled. Clara, however, felt a gnawing unease. Something within the manor had shifted, an energy she could feel crawling along the walls, whispering through the corridors, watching her. The disappearance was not random, she realized, and the manor's dark heart was stirring in ways she did not yet fully comprehend. The investigation yielded no clues. Samuel's belongings remained undisturbed, and there was no sign of a struggle. The hidden passages of the manor, the very places Clara had explored in secret, offered no answers. Some servants claimed to hear footsteps where none should exist, faint whispers that spoke Samuel's name, and glimpses of shadowed figures that vanished when approached. The villagers, already uneasy, grew terrified. They began avoiding the paths near the manor entirely, leaving the estate increasingly isolated. Speculation ran rampant. Some said Samuel had been taken by the Whitworths themselves, a sacrifice demanded by the ancient family pact. Others whispered of spirits or entities that haunted the manor, exacting vengeance on anyone who dared disturb the household. Even the skeptics, men and women of reason, found their certainty shaken. The air around Whitworth Manor carried a sense of anticipation, as though the estate itself had waited centuries for such an event to occur. Clara, unable to ignore the strange occurrences any longer, began documenting everything she had observed. The shifting shadows, the hidden symbols in the chambers, and the unnatural occurrences surrounding Samuel's disappearance. She confided in no one, not even her siblings, knowing that suspicion or misinterpretation could lead to consequences she dared not imagine. She sensed, with growing dread, that Samuel's disappearance was only the beginning, a prelude to something far greater and far more sinister. Days turned into weeks, and Samuel was never seen again. His disappearance became a grim story repeated in hushed tones at village hearths, a warning to any who dared approach the manor. The Whitworths, meanwhile, continued their lives as before, though an undercurrent of tension now ran through the halls. Jonathan spent more time in shadowed corners, his temper now sharpened by curiosity and suspicion. Margaret's fascination with death seemed to deepen, her sketches becoming darker and more intricate. Clara, determined to understand the truth, delved further into the family's hidden archives, finding documents and journals that hinted at a long-standing tradition of disappearances and secrets kept from the world. The manor, in its oppressive silence, seemed almost pleased with the events that had unfolded. Candles flickered even in empty rooms, and doors opened to reveal spaces that had never existed before. Shadows moved independently of their sources, and a faint, unearthly humming filled the air at night. as though the house itself were alive and aware of the blood that flowed through the Whitworth's veins. Clara began to understand that the disappearance of Samuel Dyer was not an isolated incident, but part of a pattern that had repeated across generations, a manifestation of the family's power, fear, and unrelenting darkness. By the end of that year, Ravensbrook had changed. The village, once simply wary of the Whitworths, now regarded them with outright fear. Paths were avoided, children were warned, and even the bravest souls spoke only in whispers. And within Whitworth Manor, the family's secrets remained carefully guarded, the shadows growing ever longer and the darkness more profound. Samuel Dyer had vanished, but his absence was only the first note in a symphony of terror that would echo through the estate for decades to come. The disappearance had marked a turning point. It was no longer merely rumor or superstition that surrounded the Whitworths, it was undeniable. The house, the family, and the very bloodline itself were tainted with a darkness that refused to be ignored. And for Clara, who had begun to see the true extent of her family's secrets, the future seemed darker than ever, filled with shadows she had yet to understand and dangers she had yet to confront. The manor had grown restless. By 1887, the fog over Ravensbrook thickened not only over the village streets but around the Whitworth estate, curling like ghostly fingers against the windows. It was during this time that Clara began to realize the depth of the darkness surrounding her family. Shadows within the manor did not merely fall, they moved with purpose. Candles burned unevenly, flickering in patterns that suggested communication. Strange symbols etched in hidden corners and forgotten rooms hinted at rituals too ancient and dangerous for ordinary understanding. It began with small observations. Clara noticed Jonathan lingering in the east wing for hours on end, whispering incantations to empty rooms. Margaret would sit for days in the attic, surrounded by her grotesque sketches, murmuring names that seemed to belong neither to the living nor the dead. Even Elias Whitworth, with his stoic demeanor, appeared to perform subtle, yet deliberate acts that no visitor or servant could interpret. Clara's instinct told her these were not mere eccentricities. They were part of something far older and far more sinister. One evening, Clara found herself drawn to the library once more, the musty scent of leather and ink filling the air. She traced her fingers along the spines of forgotten books until one, unusually thin and bound in cracked black leather, fell open. The pages were filled with symbols and diagrams she could not fully decipher, though their intent was unmistakable. They depicted rituals, dark ceremonies conducted to manipulate forces beyond the natural world. Some pages illustrated the summoning of entities, the binding of spirits, and the offering of sacrifices. The air in the library seemed heavier as she read, as though the house itself were watching, approving or warning her simultaneously. Curiosity drew her deeper into the manor than ever before. Hidden behind a false wall in the east wing was a narrow staircase descending into a cellar that none of the servants had ever mentioned. The stone steps were slick with dampness, and the air grew colder with each step. At the bottom, she found a chamber lit by hundreds of small, black candles. The walls were inscribed with cryptic runes, and in the center of the room stood a stone altar. On it lay objects that both fascinated and horrified her: a tarnished silver dagger, an ancient chalice filled with a thick, dark liquid, and a collection of faded parchments detailing ceremonial rites. The symbols seemed to pulse faintly, as if alive, and the scent of something ancient and metallic filled the air. Clara realized that these rituals were not remnants of some forgotten superstition. They were active, living practices. The Whitworths were engaged in acts designed to harness power from sources beyond human comprehension. Jonathan and Margaret's peculiar habits were not eccentricities, but components of a calculated tradition. And Elias, the patriarch, had long guided these ceremonies, ensuring that the family's influence and the darkness tied to it remained unbroken. Her investigations revealed subtle patterns. Certain nights, the manor seemed to hum with energy. Candles aligned in specific sequences would burn in unnatural ways. Shadows in the corners of hallways appeared to move with intentionality. Clara noticed that the rituals often coincided with events outside the manor: disappearances in the village, livestock found dead, unexplained illnesses. It became clear to her that the family's power extended far beyond the manor walls, and that the rituals were designed to manipulate, intimidate, and perhaps even punish those who dared oppose them. One night, she followed Jonathan into the chamber without his knowledge. He was alone, chanting softly over a series of symbols inscribed on the floor. Margaret's sketches were spread across a nearby table, depicting figures writhing in unnatural agony. Clara watched from the shadows as Jonathan completed a series of precise gestures, the air around him vibrating with an almost imperceptible energy. When he finished, the temperature dropped and a faint whisper echoed through the chamber, soft, unintelligible, yet unmistakably present. Jonathan's eyes, wide and glowing in the candlelight, reflected both triumph and terror. Clara realized then that the family's power was real and dangerous. Margaret entered shortly thereafter, carrying her sketches and arranging them around the altar. Together, the siblings performed a sequence that Clara could only partially understand, yet she sensed the malevolence behind each motion. The candle flames twisted unnaturally. Shadows reached out as if to touch them, and the faint whispering grew louder, almost forming words. Clara held her breath, unable to intervene, fearing the consequences of being discovered. This was the essence of the Whitworth legacy, the manipulation of forces humans were never meant to command. When the ceremony concluded, Jonathan and Margaret departed, leaving Clara alone in the chamber. She studied the altar and its contents, her mind racing. The rituals were meticulous, precise, and clearly guided by centuries of accumulated knowledge. The family's obsession with control, death, and the supernatural was far deeper than anyone in the village could comprehend. Clara's heart pounded with fear and exhilaration, fear of what the family could accomplish, and exhilaration at the forbidden knowledge she had discovered. She knew that her life, and perhaps the lives of the villagers, were intertwined with the rituals in ways she could not yet imagine. In the days that followed, Clara began recording her observations in secret. She documented every ritual she witnessed, every symbol, and every whispered chant. She noted how the family interacted with the manor, how shadows moved, and how energy seemed to respond to their presence. The more she wrote, the more she realized that the Whitworth's power was both inherited and cultivated, a legacy bound in secrecy, fear, and the manipulation of forces beyond comprehension. Yet Clara also sensed a flaw, a vulnerability hidden beneath layers of ritual and tradition. Though the family wielded considerable power, it was not absolute. Their influence depended on secrecy and fear. Exposure could weaken them. And so she began to plan, cautiously, carefully, knowing that her discovery of the rituals had placed her in a position of both danger and potential leverage. The Whitworths were powerful, yes, but they were also bound by their own rules, and Clara was determined to understand those rules before the darkness claimed her completely. As night fell over Whitworth Manor, the candles burned low in the hidden chamber, casting long, wavering shadows. Clara emerged from the cellar, her mind heavy with the weight of forbidden knowledge. She knew that the rituals were only a part of the family's sinister legacy, and that the true horrors were yet to come. The manor seemed to watch her as she climbed the stairs, the walls exhaling a chill that spoke of centuries of secrets, cruelty, and power. In that moment, Clara understood that she had crossed a threshold. She had glimpsed the heart of the Whitworth darkness, and there was no turning back. The rituals of the Whitworth family were no longer a mystery. They were a reality alive and insidious, and in the silent corridors of the manor, the shadows shifted once more, waiting for the next act in a story that had been centuries in the making. The Whitworth family had long been the subject of whispers, but by 1890, those whispers had evolved into outright fear. The villagers of Ravensbrook no longer spoke casually of the estate, they avoided it as one would avoid a grave. Livestock disappeared, children returned home pale and trembling from the estate's edge, and even the bravest souls would not venture near after sunset. Yet within the walls of the manor, the family continued as if untouched by the growing dread, bound together by a legacy far darker than any village rumor. It was during this year that Clara began to uncover the truth of the Whitworth's power, its source, its history, and its cost. Hidden in a forgotten wing of the manor, she discovered a leather-bound ledger, older than the family she knew. The pages were brittle. The ink faded, but the words were legible enough to reveal what had long been obscured, a pact made centuries ago with a being no mortal dared name aloud. The pact promised wealth, influence, and protection, but at a cost. The bloodline of the Whitworths was bound to this entity, and the curse it imposed demanded obedience, secrecy, and the sacrifice of those who defied it. The curse was meticulous in its design. It did not kill indiscriminately, nor did it always act immediately. Instead, it manifested slowly, subtly, influencing the family's fortunes, their behavior, and their fate. Those who strayed too far from the established order found themselves marked by misfortune, madness, or disappearance. The ledger recounted stories of ancestors who had vanished, their fates unknown, and of servants who had been claimed by the darkness for reasons that no one could fully understand. Clara realized with chilling clarity that Samuel Dyer's disappearance years earlier was no accident. It had been the first modern demonstration of the curse in action. The ledger also hinted at the method by which the Whitworths maintained control. Rituals meticulously recorded and observed ensured that the family remained aligned with the entity that granted them power. Candles, symbols, chants, and sacrifices were all part of a system designed to bind the entity's influence to the family line. Each generation learned the rites, inherited the knowledge, and perpetuated the darkness, often without question. Those who resisted faced consequences that were swift, subtle, and terrifying. Clara's understanding of the curse deepened as she read. She discovered that Jonathan's violent outbursts, Margaret's fascination with death, and even her own growing intuition were not mere quirks. They were manifestations of the curse. The entity had shaped the family's very nature, ensuring that its demands would be met and that its influence would persist. It became clear to Clara that the Whitworths' isolation, secrecy, and fear were not merely traditions. They were survival mechanisms, the only way to maintain balance with a force that could not be confronted directly. One night, she dared to confront her father. Elias Whitworth was seated in the study, his eyes reflecting the dim glow of a single candle. Clara approached cautiously, the ledger clutched to her chest. She spoke softly, her voice trembling despite a resolve. "Father, the curse of the pact, is it true?" Elias's expression did not change. His piercing blue eyes, cold and calculating, studied her as if weighing her worth. "You have found the ledger," he said finally, his voice calm but carrying the weight of centuries. "Then you have begun to understand. The curse is real, and it is our burden. It has preserved the family, shaped us, and ensured our survival. But it is not without cost, and it demands obedience." Clara's stomach turned. Obedience? To what? To an entity that claims lives. That haunts this house. Elias leaned back, his gaze unwavering. The entity is neither good nor evil in our terms. It is a force older than our understanding. It does not forgive weakness, nor tolerate rebellion. Those who defy it, or the family that serves it, are claimed. That is the nature of the curse. And now you, Clara, must choose: will you follow the path laid before you, or will you risk being claimed yourself? The weight of her father's words settled upon Clara like a physical burden. For the first time, she realized the true scope of the danger. The rituals, the disappearances, the manipulations of shadow and flame, all were connected. The Whitworths were not merely eccentric or cruel. They were participants in a covenant that transcended mortality, and the cost of failure was permanent. Her mind reeled with the implications. The curse was not simply a story or superstition. It was a living, breathing force, woven into the fabric of the family's bloodline. Each action, each decision, was a step along a path defined by centuries of pact and obedience. And yet, Clara felt a spark of defiance. She could not accept a destiny dictated by fear alone, though she understood that confronting the entity directly would be unthinkable. She needed knowledge, strategy, and patience if she hoped to survive, and perhaps one day to break the cycle. As she left the study, the manor seemed to respond to her thoughts. Shadows lengthened unnaturally along the corridors, and a chill swept through the halls as though the house itself were aware of her defiance. She realized that the curse was not confined to the family. It was tied to the manor, to every stone, every hidden room, and every shadow that lingered in its corners. To navigate this darkness, she would need to understand every secret the estate held. The following weeks were consumed by clandestine study. Clara explored hidden chambers, documented rituals, and sought clues about the entity and its limits. She discovered symbols carved into walls and floors, recordings of chants, and even accounts of failed attempts by ancestors who had sought to defy the curse. Each discovery reinforced the terrifying reality. The Whitworth legacy was a web of fear, secrecy, and power, and breaking free from it would require courage, intellect, and perhaps a touch of madness. Meanwhile, the village of Ravensbrook remained wary. Livestock continued to vanish, and occasional cries echoed from the manor grounds at night. The villagers sensed the invisible hand of the Whitworth's curse pressing upon their lives. And within the manor, Clara's siblings continued their training in the rituals, unwittingly or otherwise, strengthening the family's connection to the entity. Jonathan's temper grew sharper, Margaret's fascination with death deepened, and Elias remained the ever-watchful patriarch, guiding and observing with an almost supernatural awareness. Clara understood that the curse was no longer just a family secret. It was a force shaping history, guiding actions and determining fates. To survive, she would need to learn, to adapt, and to plan. The Whitworth legacy was a cage built from fear, shadow, and ritual, and she was determined not to become another victim within its walls. As the night fell over Whitworth Manor, the shadows seemed to pulse with life. Candles flickered, whispers echoed through hidden corridors, and the entity's presence, though unseen, was undeniable. Clara lay awake in her room, the ledger open beside her, and realized the chilling truth: the curse was eternal, the family bound to it, and the darkness that had haunted Ravensbrook for centuries was far from finished. The Whitworths were a family of power, fear, and death, and now, Clara knew, she was entwined in their sinister legacy forever. By 1890, the village of Ravensbrook had long grown accustomed to the oppressive presence of Whitworth Manor, yet it remained a source of unease that refused to fade. The fog seemed denser than ever, clinging to the hills and winding through the village streets as though it carried whispers of things unseen. The Whitworth family continued their rituals, moving like shadows within the manor, while villagers avoided even glancing at the estate's dark silhouette. But on a particularly bleak autumn evening, a new disturbance arrived, one that threatened to pierce the careful secrecy of the family and awaken consequences they had long sought to keep hidden. A stranger appeared in Ravensbrook, a man of uncertain age and attire that suggested a scholar or traveler rather than a villager. He introduced himself simply as Elias Marwood and requested lodging at the village inn. He was polite, though his eyes carried an intensity that unsettled even the most seasoned innkeeper. Within hours, he had gleaned what most outsiders would take weeks to suspect: the presence of the Whitworth Manor, its ominous reputation, and the history of disappearances and strange occurrences that had plagued Ravensbrook for decades. Word of Marwood's arrival spread quickly. Some villagers, emboldened by curiosity or fear, whispered to him about the manor and its notorious inhabitants. To each inquiry, Marwood listened carefully, nodding with a mixture of concern and calculation. Late that evening, he requested a private audience with Clara Whitworth, claiming that the village was too fearful, too cautious, and that the Whitworths themselves might not fully comprehend the dangers surrounding them. Clara, intrigued and cautious, agreed to meet him in the garden under the dim light of the waning moon. The garden of Whitworth Manor, though meticulously maintained, seemed almost otherworldly in the moonlight. Shadows pooled beneath gnarled trees, and the fog curled around the stone paths like silent serpents. Clara waited at the edge of the rose arbor, her senses alert for any sign of her father or siblings. When Marwood appeared, his presence was calm yet commanding, and the strange energy around him seemed almost tangible. "You are Clara Whitworth?" he asked, his voice low, measured, carrying a weight that suggested he had seen far more than she could imagine. "I am," she replied cautiously. "And you are?" "Elias Marwood," he said. "I am a scholar of history, and of matters that most would consider unnatural. I have studied the Whitworth lineage, Clara, and I have come to warn you. The family curse, the pact that binds you, is far more dangerous than your father may admit, or even than you may yet realize." Clara felt a chill run down her spine. She had long suspected that the family's rituals were dangerous, but to hear a stranger confirm the existence of the curse so plainly was unsettling. "You know of the curse?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Marwood nodded. "I have studied documents, journals, and reports spanning centuries. The Whitworths are bound to an entity older than humanity's memory. Its influence shapes your lives, dictates actions, and punishes defiance. Samuel Dyer's disappearance, the strange deaths and vanishings over the years. They were not accidents. They are the manifestations of a power that demands obedience." Clara's heart raced. She had already discovered fragments of this truth, but Marwood's knowledge was unsettling in its breadth. "Then, what can be done?" she asked. "Is there a way to protect ourselves? To stop it?" Marwood's eyes darkened. "There are ways, but none are simple and all carry risk," The entity is clever, bound to the family line, and intertwined with the manor itself. Any attempt to defy it directly may provoke consequences far worse than compliance. However, there is hope if subtlety, knowledge, and caution are exercised. You must understand its rules, its limitations, and the history of those who tried and failed to challenge it. He handed her a small, folded parchment, marked with a symbol she did not recognize. "This will guide you," he said. "It contains instructions, warnings, and the beginnings of knowledge you will need to survive. Keep it hidden from your father and siblings. The less they know of your intentions, the safer you will be. The curse punishes openly, but it may be manipulated subtly, if one is careful." Clara folded the parchment carefully and tucked it inside her bodice. She felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on her. The Whitworths had long been a family of secrets, but this knowledge placed her in a position she had never anticipated. She was now a participant in the delicate balance between the family and the entity, a balance that could shatter at any misstep. Marwood continued, his voice low, almost a whisper. "You must also beware your siblings. Jonathan and Margaret are deeply tied to the rituals. Their understanding of the power your family wields is instinctual and formidable. They will not easily be swayed, and any attempt to intervene openly will be seen as betrayal. Patience and observation will be your greatest allies." Clara nodded, though she could hardly trust herself to think clearly. Her mind was a storm of fear, curiosity, and determination. The ledger she had discovered, the hidden chamber, the rituals she had witnessed, all of it now fit into a larger framework she could barely comprehend. The curse was not simply a family affliction. It was a living force, and she was learning for the first time how vast its reach truly was. Before departing, Marwood fixed her with a steady gaze. "Time is not on your side, Clara. The entity grows stronger with each passing year, and the family's rituals serve to reinforce it. You have the means to observe, understand, and perhaps manipulate it, but you must act with caution. One misstep, one overt act of defiance, and the consequences will be swift and final." With that, he vanished into the fog, leaving Clara alone in the garden. The moon had shifted behind clouds, casting the paths in near total darkness. The manor loomed above her, silent and menacing, and she felt the weight of centuries pressing down through the stones beneath her feet. She understood that the game had changed. The Whitworth legacy was no longer simply something to endure. It was something to navigate, something she might one day challenge. Returning to the manor, Clara resolved to keep Marwood's warning and guidance a secret. Her father's watchful eyes and her siblings' instincts would not allow her any misstep. Yet, beneath her fear, a determination began to take root, a resolve to understand, survive, and perhaps, in time, to break the cycle that had claimed so many lives before her. That night, as the candles flickered in the hidden chambers and the shadows shifted along the hallways, Clara understood one immutable truth: knowledge was power, and survival depended not only on obedience, but on understanding the very darkness that had haunted the Whitworths for generations. The stranger's warning had illuminated the path, but it was a path fraught with danger, deception, and terror. And in the quiet heart of Whitworth Manor, the shadows seemed to lean closer, watching, waiting, as if aware that something, or someone had begun to challenge the unyielding legacy of the family curse. By 1895, Whitworth Manor had become a place where the boundary between reality and nightmare had begun to blur. The house itself seemed to breathe, its walls sighing with a weight that pressed upon every occupant. The rituals and the curse, once abstract concepts to Clara, had revealed their full magnitude, shaping the lives of every Whitworth in subtle, terrifying ways. Jonathan and Margaret, in particular, were no longer merely peculiar, they were unraveling, consumed by obsession, paranoia, and a growing awareness of powers they could barely control. Jonathan's temper had sharpened into something more dangerous than before. He paced the long corridors at odd hours, muttering incantations and examining the shadows with suspicion. Servants avoided him, whispering about the strange, almost predatory glint in his eyes. He had begun experimenting with the rituals on his own, trying to push the boundaries of the family's power. Clara observed from the shadows as her brother moved through hidden chambers, chanting over symbols and artifacts, attempting to summon forces that he could neither predict nor control. The results were often terrifying. Walls would tremble slightly, Shadows would stretch unnaturally, and a faint whispering would echo through the corridors, carrying unintelligible words that sent shivers down her spine. Margaret's descent was subtler, but equally disturbing. Her fascination with death had become an obsession. She spent hours alone in the manor's attics, surrounding herself with her grotesque sketches and the bones of small animals. Her drawings now depicted figures twisted in unnatural ways, their eyes hollow, their limbs contorted, as if reflecting visions only she could perceive. Sometimes, Clara thought she saw the figures move, shadows of the sketches writhing faintly in the flickering candlelight. Margaret spoke less and less to anyone outside the hidden chambers, murmuring names and phrases that seemed drawn from another world entirely. Clara herself felt the weight of the family's madness pressing inward. The rituals, the curses, and the influence of the manor created an atmosphere of constant tension. The air was heavy, scented faintly with wax, dust, and something metallic she could not identify. Doors would creak open on their own, candles flickered without wind, and shadows moved independently of their sources. Clara had begun to notice small, disturbing changes in herself. Her mind seemed sharper but more restless, her dreams haunted by figures that spoke in riddles and warned of impending doom. She realized with a growing sense of dread that the curse did not simply act upon the body. It worked insidiously on the mind, bending perceptions and amplifying fears until reality became nearly unrecognizable. It was in this period that Clara discovered one of the manor's most sinister secrets: hidden chambers, used for rituals long forgotten, buried behind false walls and locked doors that only the family could access. These rooms were suffused with an aura of malevolence. Symbols carved into stone walls glowed faintly in the darkness, and remnants of past ceremonies. A tarnished chalice, dried herbs, and carefully folded parchments hinted at acts too horrible to be spoken aloud. Clara felt that the house itself was alive in these chambers, reacting to her presence with a chilling awareness. The weight of generations pressed upon her, and she understood that the Whitworths' descent into madness was not simply inherited. It was cultivated, reinforced by the very stones and shadows of the manor. One night, Clara followed Jonathan into a hidden chamber she had discovered only recently. He was speaking in a low, urgent voice, tracing symbols on the floor with chalk. Margaret stood nearby, her eyes closed, murmuring phrases that Clara could barely hear. The air vibrated with a tension that made Clara's skin crawl. As she watched, the candle flames bent toward the center of the room, elongating shadows in impossible ways. A chill ran through the air, and Clara felt a presence, something unseen but palpably malignant. Jonathan's voice rose, commanding the shadows, and Margaret's whispered chants intertwined with his. For a moment, the room seemed to pulse with life, the walls exhaling a low, almost imperceptible hum that spoke of power beyond understanding. Clara realized then that her siblings were no longer merely participants in rituals. They were being consumed by them. Jonathan's attempts to control the supernatural were feeding the darkness, and Margaret's obsession had opened her mind to visions that threatened to overwhelm her entirely. Even Elias, though distant and composed, could not fully contain the forces his family had bound themselves to. The curse was asserting itself more strongly with each passing day, bending wills, twisting minds, and preparing the family for an outcome none of them could predict. The manifestations of the curse were not limited to the family alone. Strange occurrences in the village persisted, livestock vanished, villagers fell ill with unexplained maladies, and children reported seeing shadows lurking at the manor's edge. Clara began to understand that the ritual's madness and curse were interconnected. The Whitworths' power extended beyond the walls of the manor, influencing events in the village and bending the lives of innocents to the patterns set centuries before. The more she observed, the more she realized that survival would require cunning, knowledge, and discretion. Despite the horror surrounding her, Clara's resolve hardened. She documented everything: the rituals, the strange phenomena, her siblings' descent into madness, and the eerie responsiveness of the manor itself. She recognized patterns, subtle rules that governed the interactions of shadow, candlelight, and symbol. If she could understand the mechanisms of the curse, perhaps she could navigate it safely, or even find a way to weaken it. Yet she knew that any overt attempt to intervene could provoke a catastrophic backlash. The Whitworth legacy was a house of whispers, shadows, and unyielding rules, and breaking them recklessly would be fatal. As the nights grew longer, Clara began experimenting cautiously. She observed her siblings' rituals, noting every gesture, chant, and symbol. She experimented with small disruptions, moving a candle, altering a symbol slightly, to see how the forces responded. Sometimes the results were subtle. A shadow would flicker unnaturally, or a faint whisper would rise and then vanish. Other times, the consequences were more severe: a sudden chill, a door slamming in the darkness, or a shadow that seemed to lunge at her before receding. Each incident reinforced the reality that the curse was not passive. It was alive, intelligent, and intimately tied to the family's bloodline. By the end of the year, it was clear to Clara that the Whitworths were a family in the grip of their own legacy. Jonathan's rage, Margaret's obsession, and Elias's vigilance were all manifestations of the curse, yet they were also perpetuating it. The manor itself had become a living extension of the family's madness, its corridors twisting in ways that defied geometry, its hidden chambers echoing with rituals long past. Clara understood that she had entered a world where shadow and reality intertwined, where madness was both inherited and cultivated, and where survival required not only caution but a deep understanding of forces far older than humanity itself. In the stillness of the manor, as candlelight flickered and shadows moved with subtle, unsettling intelligence, Clara realized that the true horror of the Whitworth legacy was not the rituals, the curse, or even her siblings' madness. It was the inevitability of it. The family was bound to darkness, and the darkness was bound to them. Yet within her, a spark of defiance remained. She would survive, she would understand, and perhaps, one day she might find a way to escape the grip of the madness that had consumed her family for centuries. By 1895, the tension between Whitworth Manor and the village of Ravensbrook had reached a dangerous boiling point. For decades, the villagers had lived in a state of quiet terror, their lives shaped by the looming presence of the manor and the unexplained disappearances that seemed tied to its residents. Livestock vanished mysteriously. Children returned from the edges of the estate pale and silent, and faint cries were heard drifting through the fog-laden streets at night. The villagers' fear had long kept them at bay, but the disappearance of several local children in rapid succession had ignited a spark of outrage. It began with whispers in the taverns and markets. Small groups gathered to exchange fearful stories, each one more horrific than the last. Some spoke of seeing Jonathan in the manor's upper windows, chanting over symbols that glowed faintly in the candlelight. Others reported glimpsing Margaret wandering the grounds late at night, sketchbook in hand, muttering names that no living person should know. The villagers' collective anxiety coalesced into suspicion and eventually anger. The Whitworths had always been feared, but now they were no longer merely mysterious. They were seen as dangerous, an immediate threat to the safety of the community. A council of villagers convened under the old oak at the edge of the square. Led by Thomas Hargrove, the village constable, they debated their course of action. Some argued that direct confrontation would be suicidal, others insisted that the Whitworths must be held accountable for the disappearances. Old legends of the family curse were invoked, tales of spirits and dark forces that punished any who interfered. Yet the growing number of missing children left the villagers little choice. Fear had transformed into desperate courage. They decided that, under the cover of night, a delegation would approach Whitworth Manor and demand answers, or take action if refused. Clara, ever observant, had anticipated some form of village unrest. From her hidden chamber, she watched the fog roll across the fields, sensing the restless energy that had gripped Ravensbrook. She knew the villagers were approaching, though she did not yet know their intent. For the first time, she felt torn between loyalty to her family and a growing sense of justice for the innocent lives at risk. Her father's distant vigilance, Jonathan's unpredictable temper, and Margaret's unsettling powers had created a perfect storm. The villagers' uprising could trigger forces even she might not control. The night of the confrontation arrived. Torches flickered along the village path, illuminating the fog like spectral flames. The villagers moved cautiously but resolutely, their voices low but determined. At the gates of the manor they paused, unsure if they were confronting men, monsters, or something far more sinister. The wrought iron gates, imposing and foreboding, creaked open unexpectedly, as if inviting them into the shadowed estate. The air grew colder with each step, the fog curling around them like living serpents, and faint whispers drifted from the manor's towers. Jonathan, alerted to the presence of intruders, was the first to appear. He emerged from the shadows, eyes glinting with a dangerous intelligence, muttering incantations under his breath. The villagers froze, sensing an unnatural force that pressed against them. Margaret followed, her sketches in hand, and the air seemed to twist around her presence. The candles in the manor's windows flickered wildly, casting long, sinister shadows across the estate grounds. Clara watched from a hidden vantage, heart pounding, knowing that the confrontation would test every limit of her family's power and her own courage. Thomas Hargrove stepped forward, holding his hand high as a gesture of peace. "We'll come for answers!" he shouted, his voice carrying through the night. "Too many have disappeared! The children! The livestock! What is happening here?" Elias Whitworth emerged at last, calm and imposing, his presence immediately silencing the villagers. His gaze swept over the assembly, piercing and unnerving. "You accuse us of what you do not understand," he said, his voice carrying the authority of centuries. "The Whitworth family preserves a legacy older than your comprehension. What you call danger, I call duty. The events you fear are consequences of a world you cannot grasp." Jonathan stepped closer to the villagers, his anger simmering. "You think you understand the manor? You think you know what is at stake?" His voice grew louder, and the shadows around him seemed to twist and pulse in response. Margaret's whispered chants accompanied his words, the ground beneath the villagers' feet trembling faintly. Panic surged through the crowd, and a few fled, clutching their torches as though to ward off an unseen threat. But fear did not silence everyone. Some villagers pressed forward, driven by desperation and grief. One elderly woman stepped ahead, her voice trembling but determined. "We will not stand by while our children vanish! You hide behind your walls, but you are not beyond judgment." Elias' expression remained cold. "Judgment comes," he said softly, "but not as you expect. Those who trespass on Whitworth soil do so at their own risk. Know this: the curse that binds our family is neither partial nor forgiving. You face not just a man or a family, but the consequence of centuries of power that will not be denied." The tension reached a breaking point. The fog swirled violently, the torches flickered as if alive, and shadows extended unnaturally along the manor's walls. Jonathan's incantations rose, a rhythmic chant that resonated with the manor itself, while Margaret's whispers layered over them, shaping the air with unseen force. Some villagers fell to their knees, clutching their heads as unseen pressures seemed to press upon their minds. Others tried to flee, only to stumble as the shadows twisted and shifted around them. Clara, hidden among the hedges, felt a surge of both fear and power. The family's influence, the curse, the rituals, the very energy of the manor was real, overwhelming, and undeniable. Amid the chaos, Clara realized that she had a choice to intervene, risking discovery, or to watch and record. Learning how the forces of her family, and the curse, reacted under pressure, she made her decision with cold precision. If the villagers were to survive, subtle action would be required, knowledge would be her shield, and patience her weapon. The confrontation ended ambiguously. The villagers, terrorized by what they had witnessed, retreated into the fog, shaken and fearful of both the family and the forces that seemed to protect it. Whitworth Manor stood silent once more, its shadows long and unyielding, its dark heart beating steadily within the stone walls. Jonathan and Margaret returned inside, their energies slightly frayed, and Elias watched with satisfaction. The villagers had tested the family and survived, but only just. Clara, standing in the garden, felt a mixture of triumph and foreboding. She had observed the true depth of the family's power, seen the curse in action, and understood the danger it posed not only to the villagers but to herself. The revolt had failed, but the knowledge she had gained would guide her in the challenges to come. The Whitworth legacy was far from unassailable, but any attempt to challenge it openly would be met with consequences beyond imagination. That night, as the fog swallowed Ravensbrook and the manor's towers disappeared into the gray mist, Clara knew one undeniable truth: the Whitworth's power was immense, terrifying and deeply intertwined with darkness that spanned centuries. Yet she also understood that knowledge, cunning, and careful observation might offer a chance to survive and perhaps one day to break the cycle. The village revolt had been a warning. The world outside the manor would not remain passive forever, and the forces within were ready to claim all who dared to oppose them. By the turn of the century, Clara Whitworth had become acutely aware of the precarious balance she existed within. The manor had aged with her, its shadows deepening, its corridors twisting in ways that seemed to mirror the family's dark evolution. Jonathan and Margaret's descent into obsession had only intensified, and the villagers' fear of the estate had grown into a near superstitious dread. Yet amidst the chaos, Clara discovered a thread of hope, one hidden in the most unlikely place in an ancient prophecy, buried deep within the Whitworth archives, overlooked for generations. It was late one stormy evening when Clara found the manuscript. Hidden behind a false panel in the library, the parchment was yellowed and brittle, ink faded but still legible. The prophecy spoke in cryptic verse, a mixture of warning and guidance, its origin shrouded in mystery. Unlike the ritualistic records she had previously uncovered, this text seemed to transcend instructions for ceremony. It hinted at destiny, choice, and the possibility of breaking the centuries-long cycle that had bound the Whitworth family to darkness. The opening lines chilled her. One shadow walks where blood should tread, and families named by fear is fed. A child of mind both brave and true shall walk the path no curse can subdue. Clara's heart pounded. The reference to a child of mind both brave and true struck her with uncanny immediacy. Could the prophecy refer to her? The idea that she might hold the key to breaking the curse was both exhilarating and terrifying. The manuscript continued, describing events that had already transpired, the disappearances, the rituals, the descent into madness of certain family members, almost as if the prophecy had been written after the fact. But the final sections were forward-looking, detailing a series of trials, warnings, and choices that could, if properly understood, sever the bond between the family and the entity that controlled them. Clara realized immediately that knowledge alone would not be enough. The prophecy emphasized action, deliberate, careful, and precise. The curse, she understood, was reactive, intelligent, and deeply entwined with the bloodline. Any misstep could accelerate the family's downfall. The text suggested that confronting the source of the curse directly was perilous, but that there existed a path of subtle manipulation, leveraging the family's rituals and the entity's own rules to weaken its grip. Clara's mind raced as she considered what this would entail: observation, deception, patience, and above all, courage. Jonathan and Margaret, she realized, were both obstacles and tools. Their obsession and immersion in the rituals made them unpredictable, yet they also reinforced the entity's patterns. By understanding their behaviors, Clara could anticipate how the curse would respond to various actions. This realization was critical. Her siblings' madness was both a danger and a means of insight, a living reflection of the curse's influence and limitations. Elias Whitworth, meanwhile, remained a figure of composed authority, seemingly untouched by time. Yet Clara understood that even he was bound by the prophecy, though perhaps unknowingly. The text suggested that the patriarch's knowledge and control were necessary for maintaining the entity's hold, and that any disruption, intentional or accidental, could provoke catastrophic consequences. Clara felt the weight of responsibility pressing upon her. The legacy she had inherited was no longer simply about survival. It was about understanding, strategy, and timing. One false step could unravel everything. The prophecy also contained warnings about outsiders, strangers like Elias Marwood, whose arrival had already revealed gaps in the family's control. Marwood had provided knowledge, yes, but also introduced risk. The text emphasized discretion. Alliances must be hidden, and intentions masked. Clara realized that to follow the prophecy's guidance, she would have to move through layers of deception, balancing her loyalty to family, the demands of the curse, and her desire to protect innocence from the fallout of generations of darkness. As Clara studied the manuscript, the manor itself seemed to respond. Candles flickered without wind, shadows shifted subtly along the walls, and the distant chanting of Jonathan and Margaret drifted faintly through the corridors. She felt, with a mixture of fear and determination, that the prophecy had awakened awareness within the house. The entity, she understood, would recognize any significant changes, any attempts to manipulate its influence. Timing and subtlety would be crucial. Too overt an action, and it would react with deadly precision. The prophecy outlined 3 trials, each designed to test the resolve, intellect, and courage of the one who sought to confront the curse. The first was the trial of shadows, requiring navigation of the manor's hidden chambers while resisting the psychological manipulation exerted by the entity. The second was the trial of blood, emphasizing understanding of the family lineage, the rituals, and the sacrifices that had perpetuated the curse. The final trial was the trial of choice, wherein the individual would have to confront the entity's presence and make a decisive act, one that could either sever the curse permanently or doom the family entirely. Clara knew that the prophecy's trials were not mere allegory. The experiences she had endured, the rituals she had observed, and the knowledge she had acquired were all preparatory steps. The prophecy suggested that the trials were already unfolding, subtly shaping her understanding and her ability to act. Every shadow, every ritual, every whispered chant was part of a larger pattern that she now had to interpret, anticipate, and navigate. Determined to act, Clara began meticulous preparation. She documented every ritual her siblings performed, analyzed the structure of the family's power, and mapped the hidden chambers of the manor. She studied the symbols, recorded the patterns of shadows and candlelight, and noted the moments when the entity's influence seemed strongest. Every detail mattered. The prophecy suggested that even the smallest miscalculation could be fatal. Yet amidst the fear and the meticulous planning, Clara felt a flicker of hope. The prophecy suggested that the curse was not immutable, that there existed a path to liberation. The idea that she might break the cycle of darkness, free her family from the entity's grasp, and perhaps restore some measure of peace to Ravensbrook filled her with both determination and apprehension. The task ahead would be perilous, requiring intelligence, courage, and an unwavering resolve, but the possibility of success gave her purpose. That night, as the storm raged outside and the fog curled around the manor like ghostly fingers, Clara whispered the first words of her preparation, silently acknowledging the prophecy and her role within it. The house seemed to hold its breath, the shadows flickering in anticipation. As if aware that a shift was underway for the first time, Clara understood that she was no longer merely a witness to the Whitworth legacy. She was an active participant, poised on the brink of a confrontation that could determine the fate of her family, the estate, and perhaps the village itself. The hidden prophecy had illuminated a path through centuries of darkness. But Clara knew that knowing the path was only the beginning. To survive, and to fulfill what the prophecy demanded, she would need every ounce of intellect, courage, and cunning she possessed. The trials awaited, and the shadows were already watching. The year 1900 arrived like a storm over Whitworth Manor, thick fog curling around the estate, shadows stretching unnaturally along the halls, and the air itself charged with an oppressive, almost sentient energy. Clara Whitworth had spent years preparing for this moment, the culmination of observation, study, and cautious experimentation. The prophecy she had uncovered dictated the trials she would face, and she understood that this night would determine the fate of her family, the manor, and perhaps even Ravensbrook itself. For months, Clara had meticulously studied every ritual her siblings performed, mapping their movements, chants, and the subtle ways in which the entity responded. Jonathan had grown more volatile, increasingly reckless in his attempts to push the limits of the family's power, while Margaret's obsession with death and the supernatural had reached its peak. Elias Whitworth remained the steadfast patriarch, maintaining the rituals with careful precision, but even his control seemed strained under the growing tension within the manor. Clara knew that all of them, in their own way, were instruments of the entity's will, and that their power, if misused, could bring about total catastrophe. The hidden prophecy had warned of 3 trials: the trial of shadows, the trial of blood, and the trial of choice. Clara had already navigated the first 2 with meticulous care, observing, documenting, and subtly influencing events to minimize risk. The final trial, the trial of choice, was unavoidable. She would have to confront the entity directly, testing her courage, intellect, and resolve against a force older than human comprehension. There was no guidance beyond what the prophecy had provided, a test of will and the possibility of liberation or destruction. The confrontation began in the manor's ancient cellar, a chamber that had seen centuries of rituals. Candles flickered along the walls, casting grotesque, wreathing shadows. Symbols etched into stone glowed faintly, reacting to the presence of the Whitworth bloodline. Jonathan and Margaret were already there, chanting over the central altar, their voices merging in a rhythm that seemed to make the shadows pulse and the air vibrate. Clara felt the familiar chill of the entity's presence, a sentient awareness that probed her mind, testing her courage and assessing her intent. She stepped forward, clutching the folded parchment from Marwood and the notes she had compiled over the years. Her heart pounded, but she forced herself to move with purpose. "I know you," she whispered, addressing the unseen entity. "I understand the legacy, the rituals, and the curse, and I will not allow this darkness to claim more lives." The air thickened, a low hum reverberating through the chamber, and shadows stretched toward her. Coiling like serpents, Jonathan's chant faltered as he sensed the change, and Margaret's whispers grew frantic. Elias appeared calm but watchful, as though observing an unfolding inevitability. Clara realized that the entity recognized her intent. It was aware that she was neither blindly obedient nor entirely naive, and this defiance, tempered by understanding, was precisely what the prophecy had anticipated. The trial of choice demanded action beyond mere observation. Clara moved to the altar, carefully altering a symbol, a subtle shift she had studied for months. The air snapped, cold and heavy, and the candle flames bent toward her, as if drawn to her decision. Jonathan lunged to correct her, chanting with renewed urgency, while Margaret screamed, her voice mingling with the entity's low, whispering roar. The shadows convulsed, stretching across the walls, pooling at the feet of those present, and a pressure descended upon Clara's mind. Through the chaos, Clara drew on every lesson she had learned. She focused on the patterns of ritual, the entity's responses to bloodline presence, and the precise timing required to disrupt its influence. Her hands moved deliberately, tracing protective symbols she had devised in secret, each line drawn with the knowledge of its potential consequence. The shadows recoiled slightly, and for a fleeting moment, the chamber seemed to pause, the entity assessing, calculating, testing her resolve. Jonathan's fury escalated, and he struck at the altar with the ceremonial dagger. The air tore with energy, and a wave of shadow swept across the chamber. Clara felt herself nearly overwhelmed, but she held firm, invoking the final instructions from the prophecy's subtlety, precision, and courage. She whispered the words of the prophecy aloud, aligning her intent with each symbol, each chant, each carefully measured gesture. The shadows shuddered, the chanting faltered, and a strange, almost tangible pressure lifted from the room. Margaret's screams echoed as visions overwhelmed her senses, flashes of ancestors' rituals and the entity itself. But Clara remained steadfast. The entity tested her one final time, probing her mind with images of failure, despair, and the endless continuation of the curse. Clara focused, remembering every lesson, every observation, every hidden insight she had gathered over the years. She anchored herself in the knowledge that the prophecy had given her a path, and that courage, intelligence, and resolve were her weapons against the darkness. Then, with a final, deliberate motion, she completed the alignment of symbols, spoke the last words of the prophecy, and the chamber fell into silence. The shadows collapsed inward, drawing themselves toward the altar and dissipating in a cold, whispering rush. The air cleared, the oppressive weight lifted, and for the first time in centuries, Whitworth Manor felt still. Jonathan and Margaret collapsed to the ground, exhausted and disoriented, their connection to the rituals and the entity broken, or at least interrupted. Elias, though visibly shaken, remained composed, observing his daughter with a mixture of awe and acknowledgement. Clara stood at the altar, trembling but triumphant. The entity had tested her, pushed her to the limits of fear and understanding, but she had endured. The curse, though ancient and powerful, had been disrupted by her knowledge, patience, and courage. For the first time, she felt the possibility of freedom, both for herself and for the generations of Whitworths that would follow. In the days that followed, the manor seemed lighter, though the shadows never entirely disappeared. Jonathan and Margaret recovered slowly, their obsessions diminished, though traces of their former madness lingered as a cautionary reminder. The villagers of Ravensbrook, sensing a change in the manor's aura, began to approach with tentative curiosity rather than fear, though the stories of past horrors remained in whispered memory. Clara, now the steward of the family legacy, understood that the battle was not over. Vigilance, knowledge, and courage would always be necessary to maintain the fragile balance she had established. The prophecy had guided her to this moment, and she had fulfilled its demands. But Clara also knew that the true measure of success was not simply survival. It was the ability to wield knowledge responsibly, to protect the innocent, and to ensure that the darkness which had haunted her family for centuries would no longer dominate the lives of those within and beyond Whitworth Manor. As she stood in the silent chamber, candles flickering faintly, Clara realized that she was no longer merely a participant in the Whitworth legacy. She was its guardian, its breaker, and its hope. The shadows may linger, the entity may endure, and the history of darkness would always be a part of the manor. But for the first time in over 2 centuries, the Whitworths had the possibility of choice. Clara breathed deeply, feeling the weight of centuries lift from her shoulders. The final confrontation had ended, the prophecy had been fulfilled, and a new era for Whitworth Manor had begun. One defined not by fear, rituals, and the curse, but by courage, knowledge, and the determination to face darkness on her own terms.